Hello everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Bardstown, Kentucky. Population just over 13,000 souls. A place where neighbors wave from front porches. Where Friday night football games draw the entire town. Where the local Catholic Church stands as a landmark of faith and community. Where generations of families have lived on bourbon distilleries, farmland, and the simple promise of safety. This is Bourbon country, rolling green hills. Historic downtown streets lined with brick buildings that have stood since the 1800s. The kind of town where people don't lock their doors. Where children ride bikes until the streetlights flicker on. Where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are supposedly impossible to keep. But Bardstown holds secrets, dark ones. Secrets that have turned this quiet Kentucky town into one of the most mysterious and horrific in true crime history. Between 2013 and 2017, 5 people connected to this small community were murdered under circumstances that remain unsolved, unexplained, and deeply disturbing. These weren't random acts of violence scattered across decades. These were targeted killings that happened within a few years of each other, involving people who knew each other, who lived in the same area, who shared connections that investigators are still trying to untangle. Some believe these murders are linked. Others insist they're tragic coincidences. But one thing is certain. The residents of Bardstown live with fear, suspicion, and unanswered questions that have shattered their sense of security forever. Tonight, we're going to walk through every detail of what's known as the Bardstown murders. We'll explore each victim's story. We'll examine the evidence. We'll follow the investigations that have gone cold. And we'll try to understand how a town so small, so peaceful, could become the center of such relentless horror. This is a story about a teacher who was murdered in her own driveway. A police officer ambushed on a lonely highway. A mother and daughter killed in their home during a violent invasion. A father who died under suspicious circumstances while searching for answers about his daughter's death. This is a story about a town that refuses to forget, even as justice remains frustratingly out of reach. Let's begin with the first victim, the one whose death would cast a shadow over Bardstown that has never lifted. Her name was Crystal Rogers. She was 35 years old when she vanished on July 3, 2015. Crystal was a mother of 5 children. She had long brown hair, a warm smile, and a personality that drew people to her. She worked at her family's farm, helping manage the day-to-day operations. She was devoted to her kids, always putting them first, always making sure they felt loved and safe. Those who knew Crystal described her as kind-hearted and genuine. She wasn't the type to create drama or make enemies. She lived a relatively simple life in Bardstown, focused on her family and staying close to the people she loved. She had dreams of watching her children grow up, of being there for every milestone, every achievement, every moment that mattered. Crystal was in a relationship with Brooks Houck, a local businessman and the father of one of her children. They lived together in a small community just outside Bardstown. By all appearances, they were building a life together, though those close to Crystal knew the relationship had its complications. Still, nothing suggested that Crystal was in immediate danger. Nothing prepared her family for what was about to happen. On the night of July 3, 2015, Crystal Rogers was last seen at the home she shared with Brooks. She had spent the day with her children, celebrating the holiday weekend, enjoying the warmth of early summer in Kentucky. By the next morning, she was gone. Her car, a maroon Chevrolet Impala, was found abandoned on the Bluegrass Parkway with a flat tire. The keys were still in the ignition. Her purse, with her belongings inside, was left on the side of the road. But Crystal herself was nowhere to be found. Her phone was turned off. Her bank accounts went untouched. She never showed up to pick up her children. She simply vanished, as if she had been erased from existence. At first, her family hoped she had wandered away after a car accident. Maybe she was confused, disoriented, lost in the woods somewhere. But as hours turned into days, that hope began to crumble. Crystal Rogers didn't leave on her own. Someone took her, and the investigation that followed would reveal connections to other deaths. other mysteries, and a web of suspicion that stretched far beyond one missing woman. Crystal's family immediately knew something was wrong. Her mother, Sherry Ballard, was adamant from the beginning. Crystal would never abandon her children. She would never leave without telling someone. She would never just disappear. Sherry began calling everyone Crystal knew. Friends, family members, coworkers. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. The last confirmed sighting was at the home she shared with Brooks Houck. Brooks's story was simple. He claimed that Crystal had left the house on the night of July 3rd and never came back. He said he didn't know where she went. He said he assumed she'd gone to visit someone or run an errand. He didn't report her missing. That detail alone raised suspicions. Why wouldn't you report your girlfriend missing if she didn't come home? Why wouldn't you be frantically searching for her? Calling hospitals, contacting police. Brooks Houck seemed unusually calm. When investigators began questioning him, they noticed inconsistencies. Small details that didn't quite add up. Statements that shifted depending on who was asking. Crystal's car was found with a flat tire, abandoned on a parkway she wouldn't normally use. How did it get there? Who drove it? Why were her belongings still inside? Then there was the timing. Crystal vanished just 2 days before she was supposed to meet with a lawyer to discuss custody arrangements for her child with Brooks. Some wondered if that meeting had something to do with her disappearance. But Brooks denied any involvement. He said he had nothing to do with Crystal's disappearance. He said he wanted her found just as much as anyone else. His family stood by him. His friends defended him. But Crystal's family didn't believe him. And as the investigation deepened, more disturbing details began to surface. Investigators executed search warrants on Brooks Houck's property. They brought in cadaver dogs. They dug up sections of his farm, looking for evidence that Crystal had been harmed, killed, and buried there. The dogs alerted to several areas, particularly near a barn on Brooks's property. But no body was found. Then, investigators discovered something that chilled them to the bone. Crystal's boyfriend, Brooks Houck, had a brother named Nick Houck. Nick Houck was a Bardstown police officer, and he was about to become a key figure in the investigation, not just because of his relationship to Brooks, but because of what he allegedly did to interfere with the search for Crystal Rogers. The Bardstown Police Department was in an impossible position. One of their own officers, Nick Houck, was the brother of the primary suspect in a missing person case that was rapidly becoming a suspected homicide. The conflict of interest was glaring, and it didn't take long for the Kentucky State Police to take over the investigation. Nick Houck was placed on administrative leave. He denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he had no involvement in Crystal's disappearance and that he hadn't interfered with the investigation in any way. But phone records told a different story. Investigators discovered that Nick Houck had been in contact with his brother Brooks during the critical hours after Crystal disappeared. They analyzed cell phone data and found that Nick's phone had pinged off towers near the area where Crystal's car was found. Why was a police officer near the scene of an abandoned vehicle connected to a missing person case involving his own brother? Nick Houck offered explanations, but they were vague and unconvincing. He claimed he was simply checking on his brother, making sure Brooks was okay during a difficult time. But investigators suspected something far more sinister. They believed Nick Houck may have helped his brother dispose of evidence, that he may have used his position as a police officer to cover up what happened to Crystal Rogers, that he may have been complicit in her disappearance from the very beginning. In October 2015, 3 months after Crystal vanished, Nick Houck was officially fired from the Bardstown Police Department. The termination letter cited conduct unbecoming of an officer, and stated that he had interfered with the investigation into Crystal Rogers' disappearance. But firing him wasn't enough to find Crystal. The searches continued. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing in additional resources and expertise. They conducted multiple large-scale searches of the Houck family properties, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and excavation equipment. They found items of interest. Personal belongings that may have been connected to Crystal. Soil samples that suggested disturbances. But still no body. Crystal's family refused to give up. Her mother, Sherry Ballard, became a tireless advocate, organizing searches, speaking to the media, pressuring law enforcement to keep the case active. Sherry believed with absolute certainty that Brooks Houck knew what happened to her daughter, and she wasn't alone in that belief. The community of Bardstown rallied around the Rogers family. Billboards went up with Crystal's face in the plea, "Help find Crystal Rogers." Reward money was raised. Vitals were held. But as months turned into years, hope began to fade. Crystal Rogers was gone, and whoever took her had done an almost perfect job of hiding the evidence. But this was just the beginning of Bardstown's nightmare, because Crystal's case was about to intersect with another murder, one that had happened a year before she disappeared. A murder that would deepen the mystery and raise the terrifying possibility that someone in Bardstown was killing people who got too close to the truth. Tommy Ballard was Crystal Rogers' father. He was a devoted family man, a skilled builder, and a man who refused to let his daughter's case go cold. From the moment Crystal disappeared, Tommy made it his mission to find her. He spent countless hours searching the woods, fields, and back roads around Bardstown, looking for any sign of what had happened to her. Tommy didn't trust Brooks Houck. He didn't trust Nick Houck, and he wasn't shy about saying so. He believed his daughter had been murdered, and he believed the people responsible were walking free, protected by silence and possibly by corruption. Tommy was relentless. He talked to reporters. He kept Crystal's name in the public eye. He became a symbol of a father's love and determination, a man who would never stop searching, never stop fighting for justice. But on November 19, 2016, Tommy Ballard went out hunting on family property in Nelson County, just outside Bardstown. He never came home. His wife, Sherry, grew worried when he didn't return by nightfall. She tried calling his phone. No answer. She reached out to family members asking if anyone had seen him. No one had. The next morning, family members went out to the property to look for him. What they found was devastating. Tommy Ballard was lying near his vehicle, dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. At first, investigators considered the possibility of a hunting accident. Tragic but not uncommon in rural Kentucky, where hunting is a way of life. But as they examined the scene, that theory fell apart. Tommy's wound was inconsistent with an accidental shooting. The angle, the distance, the lack of any other hunters in the area. Nothing about it made sense as an accident. Tommy Ballard had been murdered, shot in cold blood on his own property, and the timing was impossible to ignore. Tommy had been actively investigating his daughter's disappearance. He had been asking questions, following leads, refusing to let the case die. He had made it clear that he believed Brooks Houck was responsible for Crystal's death. Now, just over a year after Crystal vanished, her father was dead under highly suspicious circumstances. Was Tommy getting too close to the truth? Did he uncover something that made him a threat? Was his murder a message, a warning to anyone else who might dig too deep into what happened to Crystal Rogers? The Nelson County Sheriff's Office launched a homicide investigation, but progress was slow. There were no witnesses, no obvious suspects, no clear motive, at least not one that investigators were willing to publicly confirm. But Crystal's family and the people of Bardstown believed they knew exactly why Tommy Ballard was killed. He was silenced, murdered because he wouldn't stop searching for his daughter. And now, two members of the same family were gone. One missing, presumed dead. The other shot and killed in broad daylight. The question that haunted everyone was simple and terrifying. Who would be next? By late 2016, the people of Bardstown were beginning to see a pattern. Crystal Rogers, Tommy Ballard. Two deaths, one a disappearance, one a murder, connected by family, by geography, by an investigation that someone clearly didn't want solved. But these weren't the only suspicious deaths in Bardstown. In fact, they were part of a much larger, much darker series of events that had been unfolding for years. To understand the full scope of what was happening in this small Kentucky town, we have to go back further. We have to go back to 2013. To a night that changed everything. To the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. Jason Ellis was 33 years old. He was a K-9 officer with the Bardstown Police Department. Well liked by his colleagues and respected by the community. He had served in the department for 7 years, working the night shift and patrolling the quiet streets of Bardstown with his loyal police dog Figo by his side. Jason was a dedicated officer. He took his job seriously. He was known for being thorough, professional, and fair. He wasn't the type to cut corners or look the other way. If something was wrong, Jason wanted to fix it. He was also a family man. He had a wife and 2 young sons who adored him. His life revolved around his work and his family, and those who knew him said he was living exactly the kind of life he had always wanted. On May 25, 2013, Jason was finishing up his shift. It was around 20 a.m., and he was heading home after a quiet night of patrol. He was driving along exit 34 on the Bluegrass Parkway, a stretch of highway just outside Bardstown. As he approached the exit ramp, he noticed debris scattered across the road. It looked like tree branches, maybe some trash. The kind of thing that could cause an accident if a driver didn't see it in time. Jason did what any good officer would do. He stopped his cruiser, turned on his lights, and got out to clear the debris from the roadway. He never saw the shooter. The night was still, dark. The kind of darkness that blankets rural Kentucky highways where there are no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life for miles. Jason's cruiser sat on the side of the road, blue lights flashing in rhythmic pulses. The light cut through the blackness, reflecting off the scattered branches and debris on the pavement. Jason stepped out of his vehicle. The air was cool, quiet. The only sound was the hum of his engine and the occasional chirp of insects in the surrounding woods. He walked toward the debris, his flashlight cutting a beam through the darkness. He didn't hear the footsteps, didn't hear the movement in the trees, didn't have time to react. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that shattered the silence. The bullet struck Jason in the chest, the impact throwing him backward. Pain exploded through his body as he stumbled, trying to reach for his radio, trying to call for help, trying to understand what was happening. But there was no time. Then another. The shooter was close, hidden in the darkness, methodical, precise. Jason collapsed onto the pavement, his flashlight rolling away, casting erratic shadows across the road. His police dog, Figo, was still in the cruiser, barking frantically, sensing that something was horribly wrong. Jason Ellis lay on the cold asphalt, bleeding, struggling to breathe, his life slipping away in the darkness. By the time backup arrived, it was too late. Jason was dead, shot multiples in an ambush that had clearly been planned, executed, and designed to ensure he didn't survive. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. This was an assassination. Someone had lured Jason Ellis to that spot, knowing he would stop to clear the debris. Someone had waited in the darkness, hidden in the trees, with a weapon and a plan. Someone had murdered a police officer in cold blood, and they had gotten away. The murder of Officer Jason Ellis sent shockwaves through Bardstown and the surrounding law enforcement community. Police officers are trained to handle danger, but an ambush like this, a calculated, premeditated assassination, was almost unheard of in a small town like Bardstown. The Kentucky State Police took over the investigation immediately. They cordoned off the scene, collected evidence, interviewed witnesses, and began the painstaking process of trying to identify Jason's killer. The debris on the road was clearly intentional. Someone had placed it there, knowing that any officer who saw it would stop to clear it. It was a trap, plain and simple. But who set it and why? Investigators looked into Jason's recent cases. Had he arrested someone who wanted revenge? Had he been working on something that put him in danger? Had he uncovered corruption or criminal activity that someone wanted to keep hidden? They found nothing definitive. Jason had made arrests, sure. He had dealt with drug offenders, domestic disputes, traffic violations, but nothing that seemed significant enough to warrant murder. Still, the ambush suggested that this was personal, that someone had targeted Jason specifically, that this wasn't random. Ballistics analysis revealed that Jason had been shot with a shotgun, likely a 12 gauge. The shooter had fired multiple times, ensuring that Jason didn't survive. But despite extensive searches of the area, no weapon was found. No shell casings, no clear evidence pointing to a suspect. The case went cold. Months turned into years and Jason Ellis's murder remained unsolved. His family was devastated. His colleagues were haunted by the knowledge that one of their own had been killed and that the person responsible was still out there. But then, in 2015, something happened that made investigators take another look at Jason's case. Crystal Rogers disappeared, and suddenly, people in Bardstown began asking a question that had been lurking in the back of their minds for years. Were these cases connected? The question haunted everyone in Bardstown. Was there a connection between Officer Jason Ellis's murder and Crystal Rogers' disappearance? On the surface, the cases seemed different. Jason was a police officer ambushed on a highway. Crystal was a young mother who vanished from her home. The methods were different. The circumstances were different. The timelines were 2 years apart. But there were threads connecting them. Brooks Houck, the primary suspect in Crystal's disappearance, had been questioned early in the investigation into Jason Ellis's death. Not because he was a serious suspect, but because investigators were looking at everyone in Bardstown who might have had contact with the officer. Brooks had been interviewed, he had an alibi. Nothing concrete tied him to Jason's murder, and the lead went nowhere. But now, with Crystal missing and Brooks under intense scrutiny, investigators began to wonder if they had missed something. Had Brooks been involved in Jason's death? Had Jason stumbled onto something that threatened Brooks? Was there a connection they hadn't seen before? There was another theory, one that was even more disturbing. Nick Houck, Brooks's brother and the fired Bardstown police officer, had worked alongside Jason Ellis. They had been colleagues. They had patrolled the same streets, worked the same shifts, shared the same locker room. What if Nick knew something about Jason's murder? What if he had been involved? What if the reason he interfered with Crystal's investigation wasn't just to protect his brother, but to protect himself? The theory was explosive, but it was difficult to prove. Nick Houck denied any involvement in Jason Ellis's death. He denied interfering with Crystal's investigation beyond what he admitted. He maintained that he was innocent, that he was being unfairly targeted because of his brother's relationship with Crystal. But the suspicion lingered, and it grew stronger when investigators discovered something troubling about the night Jason Ellis was killed. According to dispatch records, Nick Houck had been on duty that night. He had been patrolling Bardstown, working the same shift as Jason. He would have known Jason's route. He would have known his habits. He would have known where Jason might stop, what he might do if he saw debris on the road. Nick had also been one of the first officers to arrive at the scene after Jason was shot. Was that a coincidence, or was it something more sinister? Investigators looked closely at Nick's movements that night, but they couldn't place him at the scene of the shooting. His cruiser's GPS data didn't show him at exit 34 at the time of the murder. His radio transmissions were consistent with being elsewhere. But GPS could be turned off. Radio silence could be maintained. And if someone knew how the system worked, if someone was a police officer who understood how to avoid detection, they could potentially commit a crime and cover their tracks. Still, it wasn't enough to charge Nick Houck with Jason's murder. It wasn't even enough to name him as an official suspect. But the possibility was there, hanging over the investigation like a dark cloud. And then, just when it seemed like the Bardstown cases couldn't get any more complicated, another tragedy struck. One that would tie the entire nightmare together in a way that no one could have predicted. A date that falls between Jason Ellis's murder in 2013 and Crystal Rogers' disappearance in 2015. A date that adds 2 more names to Bardstown's growing list of victims. Kathy Netherland was a 48-year-old special education teacher at Bardstown Elementary School. She was beloved by her students, respected by her colleagues, and known throughout the community as a kind, patient, and dedicated educator. Kathy had spent over 2 decades teaching children with special needs, pouring her heart into helping students who struggled, who needed extra support, who deserved someone who believed in them. She was that person. She was the teacher who stayed late, who brought supplies from home, who made sure every child in her classroom felt valued. Her daughter, Samantha Netherland, was 16 years old. She was a sophomore at Bardstown High School, a bright and ambitious student with dreams of going to college and becoming a nurse. Samantha was involved in school activities, had a close group of friends, and was described by everyone who knew her as sweet, respectful, and full of potential. Kathy and Samantha lived together in a small house on Springfield Road, just outside Bardstown. It was a modest home, surrounded by farmland and woods, the kind of place where you could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the distant sounds of cattle lowing in the fields. It was peaceful, safe, the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But on the night of April 21st, 2014, something unspeakably evil came to that house. The sun had set hours ago. The house on Springfield Road was dark except for the warm glow of lights in the windows. Inside, Kathy and Samantha were settling in for the evening. It was a Monday night, a school night. Kathy had likely been grading papers or preparing lessons for the next day. Samantha had probably been doing homework, texting friends, scrolling through social media. Just a normal night, a quiet night. But someone was watching. Someone was waiting. At some point that evening, an intruder, or possibly more than one, approached the house. They didn't break in through a window or kick down a door. The evidence would later suggest that they may have been let inside, or that they found an unlocked entrance. However they got in, once they were inside, they brought violence with them. The attack was brutal and methodical. Kathy Netherland was found in the hallway of her home. She had been shot multiple times. The evidence suggested she had tried to fight back, tried to protect her daughter, tried to stop whatever horror was unfolding in her home. But she was overpowered. Samantha was found in a bedroom. She had also been shot multiple times. The evidence indicated that she had been killed in a particularly vicious manner, suggesting rage, hatred, or a desire to ensure there were no survivors. Both mother and daughter suffered deeply before they died. The crime scene was horrific. Blood spattered the walls. Furniture was overturned. Shell casings littered the floor. It was clear that a violent struggle had taken place, that Kathy and Samantha had fought for their lives. But they never had a chance. The killer, or killers, made sure of that. By the time their bodies were discovered the next day, rigor mortis had already set in. They had been dead for hours, lying in their own home, surrounded by the life they had built together. Kathy's car was missing from the driveway. It was later found abandoned in a nearby community, adding another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible crime. Who would do this? Who would invade a home and murder a teacher and her teenage daughter in cold blood? What possible motive could justify such brutality? The investigation began immediately, but from the start, it was clear that this case was going to be extraordinarily difficult to solve. The Nelson County Sheriff's Office led the investigation, with assistance from the Kentucky State Police. They processed the crime scene, collected evidence, interviewed neighbors, and began building a timeline of Kathy and Samantha's final hours. What they found was deeply troubling. There was no sign of forced entry. The doors and windows appeared to be intact, suggesting that the killer either had a key, found an unlocked door, or was let inside by Kathy or Samantha. That detail alone narrowed the possibilities. It suggested that the killer might have been someone the victims knew, someone they trusted enough to allow into their home. But who? Kathy was a schoolteacher with no known enemies. She wasn't involved in drugs, crime, or anything that would put her at risk. She lived a quiet, ordinary life dedicated to her daughter and her students. Samantha was a 16-year-old high school student. She wasn't involved in gangs, didn't have a troubled past, wasn't connected to any dangerous individuals. So why were they targeted? Investigators considered several theories. Theory 13, maybe the killer broke in intending to steal valuables and was surprised to find Kathy and Samantha home. Maybe the murders were an attempt to eliminate witnesses. But this theory had problems. Nothing of significant value appeared to be missing from the home. The house wasn't ransacked the way a typical burglary scene would be, and the level of violence seemed excessive for a robbery. Theory 1, maybe someone had a grudge against Kathy or Samantha. Maybe there was a dispute, a conflict, a relationship gone wrong. Investigators looked into Kathy's personal life. She had been divorced, but her ex-husband had an alibi and no apparent motive. She wasn't dating anyone seriously. She didn't have ongoing feuds or conflicts with anyone. Samantha's life was similarly unremarkable. She had friends, a normal social life for a teenager, and no known enemies. Theory 30. Maybe the Netherland home was chosen at random by a stranger or a drifter passing through the area. But the execution of the crime suggested planning and intent. This wasn't a spontaneous act. The killer knew what they were doing. Theory 4-day. This was the theory that terrified people the most. What if Kathy and Samantha's murders were connected to Jason Ellis's death? What if there was a serial killer operating in Bardstown, targeting people for reasons that weren't yet clear? May 25, 2013, Officer Jason Ellis murdered. April 21, 2014, Kathy and Samantha Netherland murdered. July through 20, Crystal Rogers disappears. November 19, 2016. Tommy Ballard murdered. 4 separate incidents. 5 victims. All in the same small town. All within a span of less than 4 years. It couldn't be a coincidence. Or could it? Ballistics analysis showed that Kathy and Samantha had been shot with a firearm, but the weapon was never recovered. The shell casings found at the scene were collected and analyzed, but they didn't match any weapons in law enforcement databases. DNA evidence was collected from the crime scene, but it didn't produce any immediate matches. Either the killer wasn't in the system, or they had been careful not to leave identifiable DNA behind. Fingerprints were lifted from various surfaces in the home, but again no matches were found. The lack of physical evidence was frustrating. Whoever killed Kathy and Samantha had either been extremely careful, extremely lucky, or both. Kathy's stolen car was found abandoned in a community called Botland, about 10 miles from the murder scene. It had been wiped clean of fingerprints. There was no sign of the killer. Investigators canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, and reviewed security footage from nearby businesses. They found nothing. No witnesses, no suspects, no clear motive. The case went cold. The murders of Kathy and Samantha Netherland devastated the Bardstown community. Kathy was a teacher. She had taught hundreds of children over the years. She had touched countless lives. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, students, parents, colleagues, friends, all trying to make sense of a senseless tragedy. Samantha was just a child, a teenager with her whole life ahead of her. Her classmates held valise balloons, created memorials. They couldn't understand why someone would take her away. Parents in Bardstown were terrified. If a teacher and her daughter could be murdered in their own home, then no one was safe. People started locking their doors, installing security systems, buying guns for protection. The sense of security that had defined Bardstown for generations was shattered. And the questions wouldn't stop. Who did this? Why? Will they ever be caught? Will there be more victims? Some people in Bardstown, the murders were the work of an outsider, someone who passed through and was long gone. Others believed the killer was local, someone who knew the area, someone who might still be living among them. And a growing number of people believed that all the Bardstown cases were connected, that there was a pattern, a conspiracy, a darkness that had taken root in their town and refused to let go. As investigators dug deeper into the Netherland murders, they began to notice something strange. Kathy Netherland had been a teacher at Bardstown Elementary School. Officer Jason Ellis had children who attended Bardstown Elementary School. It was a small connection, but it was a connection nonetheless. Had Kathy taught Jason's children? Had they known each other? Had there been some interaction that put them both in danger? Investigators looked into it, but they couldn't find any significant link. Jason's children hadn't been in Kathy's special education classes. There was no evidence that they had a relationship beyond the casual acquaintance that exists in a small town. Still, the fact that both victims had ties to the same school raised eyebrows. Then there was Brooks Houck. Brooks had grown up in Bardstown. He had attended Bardstown schools. So had his brother Nick. So had Crystal Rogers. Had Brooks or Nick known Kathy Netherland? Had they had any contact with Samantha? Again, investigators couldn't find a definitive connection. But the web of relationships in a small town like Bardstown is complicated. Everyone knows everyone. Families are interconnected. Paths cross in ways that aren't always documented or remembered. The possibility that these cases were connected remained alive, even if the evidence wasn't there to prove it. In 2017, 3 years after the Netherland murders, investigators received a tip that would reignite the case. A man named Houck, not Brooks or Nick, but a distant relative, had allegedly made statements suggesting he knew something about the murders. Investigators tracked him down and brought him in for questioning. He denied everything, said he didn't know anything, said people were spreading rumors. But the tip had mentioned specific details about the crime scene, details that hadn't been made public. How did this person know those details? Had they been at the scene? Had they been told by someone who was? Investigators pressed harder, but the man lawyered up and refused to say anything more. The lead went cold. But it raised a troubling question. How many people in Bardstown knew more than they were saying? How many people were protecting the killers, either out of fear, loyalty, or complicity? By 2016, Tommy Ballard had become obsessed with finding answers. His daughter, Crystal, had been missing for over a year. He believed she was dead. He believed Brooks Houck had killed her. And he was determined to prove it. But Tommy wasn't just focused on Crystal's case. He had started to see the bigger picture. He had started to ask questions about Jason Ellis, about Kathy and Samantha Netherland, about whether all these cases were connected. Tommy began conducting his own investigations. He talked to people in Bardstown. He followed leads that law enforcement had abandoned. He put up signs and billboards not just for Crystal, but calling for justice for all the victims. He was relentless, fearless. He didn't care if he made people uncomfortable. He didn't care if he made enemies. He wanted the truth. And then on November 19, 2016, Tommy Ballard was shot and killed while hunting on his own property. His murder sent a message that was impossible to ignore. Stop asking questions, or you'll end up dead too. The investigation into Tommy Ballard's death was handled by the Nelson County Sheriff's Office, the same agency that had investigated the Netherland murders. From the beginning, investigators suspected foul play. The wound, the location, the timing. Nothing about Tommy's death looked like an accident. But there were no witnesses, no suspects, no clear evidence pointing to a killer. Tommy's family believed he was murdered because he was getting too close to the truth about Crystal's disappearance. They believed Brooks Houck was responsible, either directly or indirectly. But Brooks had an alibi. He was nowhere near the property where Tommy was killed. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. Still, the belief persisted. Someone wanted Tommy Ballard dead. Someone wanted him to stop asking questions. Someone wanted the investigations to end. And they got their wish. Tommy was gone. The voice calling for justice was silenced. By the end of 2016, Bardstown was a town paralyzed by fear and suspicion. 5 people dead or missing. Multiple unsolved cases. A pervasive sense that the killers were still out there walking the same streets, shopping in the same stores, attending the same churches. People didn't trust each other anymore. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire. Everyone had a theory. Everyone thought they knew who was responsible. But no one had proof. The investigations dragged on. The FBI got involved in Crystal's case, conducting massive searches of the Houck properties. They tore up barns, dug up fields, searched ponds and wells. They found nothing. Jason Ellis's case remained cold. Kathy and Samantha Netherland's case remained cold. Tommy Ballard's case remained cold. Crystal Rogers was still missing. Brooks Houck had become the most hated man in Bardstown. He was never charged with Crystal Rogers' disappearance. He was never arrested. He maintained his innocence from the beginning, insisting that he had nothing to do with what happened to Crystal. But in the court of public opinion, he had already been convicted. People saw him around town and turned away. Former friends refused to speak to him. His business suffered. He received death threats. People vandalized his property, spray painting accusations on his barn, leaving threatening messages on his voicemail. Brooks's family stood by him. They insisted he was innocent. They said he was being unfairly targeted, that people were using him as a scapegoat because the real killer hadn't been found. But the evidence, or lack thereof, kept pointing back to Brooks. He was the last person to see Crystal alive. His story about that night had inconsistencies. His behavior after she disappeared was suspicious. The cadaver dogs had alerted on his property. His brother, a police officer, had interfered with the investigation. Even if there wasn't enough evidence to charge him, the circumstantial case against Brooks was overwhelming. And then there was the matter of his other brother. Brooks had another sibling who became a person of interest in the investigation, not because of direct involvement, but because of statements he allegedly made to people in Bardstown. According to several sources, this brother had hinted that he knew what happened to Crystal. that Brooks had confided in him, that the family was protecting Brooks because they believed he had acted in self-defense or in a moment of rage, not premeditated murder. These were just rumors, unverified statements passed through the grapevine of a small town where gossip traveled faster than truth. But investigators took them seriously. They brought in multiple members of the Houck family for questioning over the years. They executed search warrants on properties owned by various Houcks. They analyzed phone records, financial transactions, and social media activity. They found nothing concrete, nothing that would hold up in court, nothing that could bring Crystal home or give her family the closure they desperately needed. The more investigators dug into Crystal's case, the more confusing it became. Her car was found on the Bluegrass Parkway with a flat tire. But the tire wasn't just flat, it had been deliberately damaged. Someone had punctured it, possibly to disable the vehicle and force Crystal to stop. But why was the car on the parkway in the first place? Crystal rarely used that road. It wasn't on her normal routes. How did the car get there? Brooks claimed he didn't know. He said Crystal must have driven there herself, though he couldn't explain why. But investigators had another theory. Someone else drove the car there and staged it to look like Crystal had car trouble and wandered off. The keys were in the ignition. Her purse was inside. But her phone was missing and had been turned off shortly after she disappeared. Who turns off their phone before leaving their car on the side of the highway? It didn't make sense unless someone wanted to prevent her from being tracked. Then there were the searches of Brooks's property. Multiple cadaver dogs alerted in the same areas, near a barn near a pond, in a section of woods at the edge of his land. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect the scent of human decomposition. They don't alert unless their scent is present. So why didn't investigators find a body? There were several possibilities. The body had been moved after the dogs alerted. The body had been buried, then dug up and relocated. The body had decomposed to the point where it was no longer detectable by traditional search methods. The dogs were wrong, a rare but possible scenario. Investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar. They excavated sections of the property where the dogs had alerted. They drained ponds. They searched wooded areas with cadaver dogs from multiple agencies to confirm the alerts. Still, they found nothing. It was maddening. Everything pointed to Crystal being dead, to her body having been on Brooks's property at some point, but the physical evidence just wasn't there. Had Brooks hidden her body so well that even the most advanced search techniques couldn't find it? Had he had help? Had he moved her body multiple times to throw off investigators? Or was there something else going on, something investigators hadn't considered? Over the years, the investigation into Crystal's disappearance generated hundreds of tips. Some were credible. Some were wild conspiracy theories. Some were outright hoaxes. One tip claimed that Crystal had been seen alive in another state, living under a new identity. Investigators tracked down the lead, but it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. The woman wasn't Crystal. Another tip suggested that Crystal had been killed by a drug cartel because she had witnessed something she shouldn't have. This theory gained traction for a while, especially since Nelson County had seen an increase in drug activity in recent years. But there was no evidence that Crystal was involved in the drug trade, or that she had any connection to criminal organizations. Then there was the theory that Crystal had been killed by someone completely unrelated to Brooks Houck, that the focus on Brooks was a mistake that had allowed the real killer to escape justice. Some people pointed to other men in Crystal's life, ex-boyfriends, former coworkers, people she had dated before Brooks. Investigators looked into each one, but none of them had a motive and opportunity, or any evidence linking them to her disappearance. There were tips about suspicious vehicles seen near the area where Crystal's car was found, tips about people burning items in barrels on their property in the days after she disappeared, tips about someone bragging in a bar about getting away with murder. Every tip was investigated. Most led nowhere. In August 2020, 5 years after Crystal Rogers disappeared, the FBI announced that they were taking over the investigation. This was a significant development. The FBI has resources that local agencies don't. They have forensic experts, behavioral analysts, advanced technology, and the authority to bring in specialists from around the country. Their involvement signaled that the case was being taken to a new level. The FBI immediately executed multiple search warrants on properties owned by Brooks Houck and his family. These weren't small searches. These were massive coordinated operations involving dozens of agents, heavy equipment, and specialized search teams. They focused on a farm that Brooks owned, tearing up sections of land, removing soil samples, and using cutting-edge technology to search for any trace of Crystal's remains. They also searched a property owned by Brooks's grandmother, who had since passed away. Investigators believe that Brooks may have used this property to hide evidence because it was more secluded and less likely to be searched. The searches lasted for days. News helicopters circled overhead. Reporters camped out on the roadside. The nation was watching. Crystal's family waited, hoping that this time, finally, they would get answers. But when the searches concluded, the FBI announced that they had collected evidence and would continue analyzing it, but they didn't announce any arrests. They didn't find Crystal's body. The waiting continued. While the FBI was focused on Crystal's case, other investigators were taking a fresh look at the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. New technology had become available since 2013. Forensic techniques had advanced. Cold case investigators with fresh eyes were reviewing the evidence, and they were finding things that had been overlooked. The debris on the road where Jason was killed had been carefully placed. It wasn't random trash that had blown onto the highway. It was branches and other materials that had been deliberately arranged to look natural but were positioned to force a driver to slow down or stop. This suggested planning, premeditation, knowledge of law enforcement procedures. Whoever killed Jason knew that an officer would stop to clear the debris. They knew that Jason would be alone. They knew where to position themselves for the ambush. That level of knowledge pointed to someone who understood police work. Someone like another officer. Or someone who had been coached by an officer. Investigators revisited Nick Huck's involvement. They looked at his movements that night, his communications, his relationship with Jason. Nick and Jason had worked together for years. They weren't close friends, but they were cordial. They had no known conflicts. But what if there was something beneath the surface? What if Jason had discovered something about Nick that put him in danger? Some theorized that Jason had stumbled onto corruption within the Bardstown Police Department. That he had seen something illegal, something that implicated Nick or other officers, and that he was killed to keep him quiet. This theory was explosive, and it gained traction in certain circles, especially online where amateur sleuths dissected every detail of the case. But there was no hard evidence to support it. Jason's personnel file showed no indication that he was investigating other officers. His cases didn't reveal any pattern of corruption. His colleagues insisted he never mentioned being threatened or afraid. Still, the theory persisted. Because in Bardstown, nothing was as it seemed, and everyone had secrets. Over the years, several people came forward claiming they had information about the Bardstown cases. Some were credible witnesses. Others were attention seekers. And some were people who genuinely believed they knew something, but couldn't quite put the pieces together. One witness claimed to have seen Brooks Huck's truck on a back road, late at night around the time Crystal disappeared. The witness said the truck was parked in a remote area. Brooks appeared to be doing something near the bed of the truck, though the witness couldn't see clearly in the darkness. This tip was investigated, but without physical evidence. It was just one person's word. Another witness came forward years later, saying they had overheard a conversation in a bar where someone joked about getting rid of a problem around the time of Crystal's disappearance. The witness couldn't identify who said it, and by the time they reported it, memories had faded and details were unclear. Then there was a witness who claimed to have seen a suspicious fire on a property near Brooks's land shortly after Crystal vanished. The fire had been large, burning for hours, and the witness remembered thinking it was odd that someone would be burning something in the middle of the night. Could Brooks have been burning evidence? Clothing, items that connected him to Crystal's death. Investigators looked into it, but the property where the fire allegedly occurred had changed hands multiple times, Any evidence that might have existed was long gone. There were also witnesses who came forward with information about the Netherland murders. One neighbor reported hearing gunshots on the night Kathy and Samantha were killed, but they didn't think much of it at the time because gunfire was common in rural Kentucky, especially during hunting season. Another witness claimed to have seen a vehicle speeding away from the Netherland property around the estimated time of the murders, but they couldn't describe the vehicle or the driver in any detail. Every piece of information was logged, analyzed, and cross-referenced with other evidence, but none of it led to an arrest. In 2018, investigators received a tip that would send shockwaves through the investigation. A man incarcerated in another state claimed that he had information about the Netherland murders. He said he knew who killed Kathy and Samantha, and he was willing to talk in exchange for consideration on his own charges. This kind of jailhouse confession is common in high-profile cases. Inmates looking for deals or attention will often claim to know things they don't. But this inmate provided details that hadn't been made public. He described the layout of the Netherland home. He mentioned specific items that had been found at the scene. He talked about the sequence of events in a way that aligned with the evidence. Investigators were intrigued. They brought the inmate in for extensive questioning. He told them that he had been told the story by someone he met in jail years earlier, someone who had bragged about killing a teacher and her daughter in Kentucky. According to the inmate, this person had described the murders in graphic detail, explaining how he had entered the home, how he had shot Kathy first, and how he had then killed Samantha to eliminate the witness. The motive, according to this account, was robbery. The killer had believed there were valuables in the home, particularly guns and cash. But when he didn't find what he was looking for, he panicked and killed the victims to avoid being identified. Investigators were skeptical but intrigued. They asked the inmate to identify the person who had confessed to him. He provided a name. Investigators tracked the person down. The individual had a criminal history, including burglary and assault. He had been in the area around the time of the Netherland murders. But when they questioned him, he denied everything. He said he had never confessed to anyone, that the inmate was lying to get a deal, and that he had an alibi for the night of the murders. Investigators checked the alibi. It was weak but not impossible. They looked for physical evidence linking this individual to the crime scene. They found nothing. The DNA collected from the Netherland home didn't match him. His fingerprints didn't match. There was no forensic evidence tying him to the murders. The confession, as compelling as it had seemed, fell apart. The lead went cold. And once again, the Netherland family was left without answers. As frustrating as it was, investigators had to consider the possibility that the Bardstown cases were not connected. That Jason Ellis's murder was the result of a personal vendetta or a random ambush by someone with a grudge against police. That Kathy and Samantha Netherland were killed by a burglar or someone they knew personally, unrelated to any other case. That Crystal Rogers' disappearance was entirely about her relationship with Brooks Houck and had nothing to do with the other deaths. That Tommy Ballard's murder was a targeted killing meant to stop his investigation into his daughter's case, but not part of a larger conspiracy. In other words, maybe Bardstown had simply been unlucky. Maybe this small town had been the site of multiple tragedies that happened to occur in close proximity, but without any connecting thread. But most people didn't believe that. The timing was too perfect. The connections, however tenuous, were too numerous. The sense that someone was orchestrating these events, or at least benefiting from them, was too strong. Bardstown wasn't just unlucky. Bardstown was being hunted. One of the most maddening aspects of the Crystal Rogers case was the paradox of Brooks Houck. On one hand, he was clearly the prime suspect. Everything pointed to him. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. On the other hand, despite years of investigation, despite FBI involvement, despite massive searches and intense scrutiny, no one could prove he had done anything. He hadn't been charged. He hadn't been arrested. He was, in the eyes of the law, innocent. But in the eyes of Crystal's family and most of Bardstown, he was guilty. This created a strange, intense situation. Brooks continued to live in Bardstown, running his business, going about his life as if nothing had happened. He rarely spoke to the media. He didn't defend himself publicly. He just existed, a ghost of a man surrounded by suspicion but untouched by the law. Crystal's family, meanwhile, continued their relentless search for justice. Sherry Ballard, Crystal's mother, became a tireless advocate. She organized searches. She lobbied lawmakers to keep the case active. She spoke at rallies, gave interviews, and refused to let Crystal's name fade from public memory. Sherry had lost her daughter. She had lost her husband much. But she refused to lose hope. She believed that one day, someone would talk. Someone would come forward with a piece of information that would crack the case wide open. She believed that justice would eventually come, even if it took the rest of her life. In 2021, the FBI announced that they were using new forensic technology to analyze evidence collected from the Houck properties. They didn't specify what technology they were using, but experts speculated it could be advanced DNA analysis, isotope testing, or other cutting-edge techniques that weren't available when Crystal first disappeared. The announcement gave Crystal's family a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Months passed, then a year. 2 years, no arrests were made. The FBI continued to describe the investigation as active and ongoing, but they provided no updates, no timelines, no indication might be resolved. The waiting was agonizing. But Crystal's family had learned to live with agony. They had learned to function in a state of suspended grief, never able to fully mourn because they didn't have a body, didn't have closure, didn't have answers. They existed in limbo, hoping for justice but preparing for disappointment. The people of Bardstown were divided. Some believed that Brooks Houck was guilty, and that the authorities were failing to bring him to justice. Others believed that he was being unfairly targeted, that the lack of evidence proved his innocence, and that the real killer was still out there. And some people refused to take a side, afraid that aligning with one camp or the other would make them targets. Because that's what Bardstown had become, a place where speaking up could get you killed. Tommy Ballard had spoken up, and he was dead. Others who had publicly supported the Rogers family reported receiving threats, experiencing vandalism, or being ostracized by certain segments of the community. Fear had taken root in Bardstown, and it was growing. People stopped trusting each other. Neighbors eyed each other with suspicion. Friendships fractured along lines of who you believed and who you didn't. The town that had once been defined by community and connection was now defined by division and distrust. And through it all, the cases remained unsolved. After Tommy Ballard's murder, his widow, Sherry Ballard, made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would never stop searching for Crystal. She would never stop fighting for answers about her husband's death. And she would never, ever let Brooks Houck forget what he had done. Sherry became more than just a grieving mother and widow. She became an investigator, an advocate, and a voice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. She hired private investigators to look into Crystal's case. She consulted with forensic experts, searched through public records, and followed up on tips that law enforcement had deemed too weak to pursue. She organized search parties that conned through woods, fields, and abandoned properties across Nelson County. Volunteers showed up by the dozens, some from Bardstown, others from across Kentucky, all united by the belief that Crystal deserved to be found. Sherry appeared on true crime podcasts, television shows, and news programs. She spoke at rallies for missing persons. She lobbied state legislators to improve resources for cold case investigations. She refused to be silenced the way her husband had been silenced. But her activism came at a cost. Sherry received threats, anonymous messages warning her to stop asking questions, phone calls in the middle of the night with no one on the other end, vehicles following her when she drove through town. She reported everything to the police, but the threats continued. Some people in Bardstown admired Sherry's courage. Others thought she was obsessed, unable to move on, making the situation worse by keeping it in the public eye. But Sherry didn't care what people thought. She had one mission: find out what happened to Crystal and bring her killer to justice. And she believed, with absolute certainty, that she knew who that killer was. As investigators continued to dig into the Bardstown cases, a new theory began to emerge. What if these murders weren't the work of one person? What if there were multiple perpetrators working together, either as co-conspirators or as separate individuals whose crimes happened to intersect? This theory was complex, but it fits some of the evidence better than the idea of a single serial killer. Consider the possibilities. Scenario 1: Brooks Houck killed Crystal, but someone else killed Jason Ellis in the Netherlands. This would explain why the crimes had different methods and motives. Crystal's disappearance seemed personal, tied to her relationship with Brooks. But Jason's ambush and the Netherlands home invasion had different signatures. Maybe they were unrelated after all. But then how do you explain Tommy Ballard's murder? If he was killed to stop his investigation into Crystal's case, that suggests a connection between at least two of the crimes. Scenario 2: Brooks Houck killed Crystal with help from his brother Nick and possibly other family members. This theory suggested that the Houck family had conspired to cover up Crystal's murder. Nick, as a police officer, would have had the knowledge and access to interfere with the investigation. Other family members may have helped hide the body or dispose of evidence. If this was true, it would explain why the searches of Houck properties kept turning up cadaver dog alerts but no body. Maybe Crystal had been moved multiple times, with different family members taking turns hiding her remains. But proving a conspiracy is incredibly difficult, especially when the suspects stay silent and refuse to cooperate with investigators. Scenario 3: A criminal network operating in Bardstown. Some theorists believe that Bardstown had become a hub for organized crime trafficking, illegal gambling, or other illicit activities, and that the murders were related to people who knew too much or got in the way. This theory suggested that Jason Ellis may have been killed because he was investigating criminal activity. That Kathy Netherland may have witnessed something she shouldn't have. That Crystal may have been involved with dangerous people through Brooks or someone else. And that Tommy Ballard was killed because he was getting too close to exposing the network. This theory was popular in certain circles, especially among those who believed that corruption ran deep in Bardstown's law enforcement and local government. But like many conspiracy theories, it was long on speculation and short on evidence. Scenario 4: The crimes are connected, but not in the way anyone expects. This was the most unsettling possibility. What if the connection between the cases wasn't direct, but circumstantial? What if the murders were committed by different people, but those people were all connected through relationships, shared secrets, or mutual interests? For example, what if Jason Ellis was killed by someone unrelated to the other cases, but that person confided in someone who later committed another murder? What if Brooks Houck killed Crystal, but someone else who knew about it decided to kill Tommy Ballard to protect Brooks? In this scenario, the cases would be linked, but not through a single mastermind or conspiracy. They would be linked through a web of relationships, shared knowledge, and overlapping motives. It was a chilling thought, because if this was true, it meant that multiple people in Bardstown were capable of murder, and they were all protecting each other. Despite the lack of arrests, forensic analysis continued on all the Bardstown cases. In Crystal's case, soil samples taken from the Houck properties were analyzed for traces of decomposition. Some samples showed elevated levels of certain chemicals consistent with human remains, but not conclusive enough to prove a body had been buried there. Cadaver dogs had alerted in multiple locations over the years, but excavations in those areas hadn't produced results. This led some experts to theorize that Crystal's body may have been buried temporarily, then moved after investigators started searching the property. If true, this would require planning, resources, and help. You can't dig up and relocate a body easily, especially if you're under surveillance. In Jason Ellis's case, we examined the ballistics evidence from the shooting. The weapon used was a shotgun, likely a 12 gauge, but the specific make and model couldn't be determined from the limited evidence available. Investigators created a profile of the shooter based on the trajectory of the shots and the position of Jason's body. The shooter had been positioned above the roadway, likely on embankment or hill, giving them a clear line of sight to the exit ramp where Jason stopped. This suggested that the shooter knew the terrain, had scouted the location beforehand, and had chosen a spot that provided both concealment and a good shooting angle. It was professional, calculated, not the work of an amateur. In the Netherlands case, DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was run through national databases multiple times over the years as technology improved and new profiles were added. In 2019, investigators announced a potential breakthrough. The DNA might match someone in the system, but the sample was degraded and the match wasn't strong enough to be definitive. They needed additional evidence to confirm the identity. But without a suspect to compare it to, the DNA evidence remained useful only if someone was arrested for another reason and could be compelled to provide a sample. In Tommy Ballard's case, forensic analysis of the gunshot wound suggested that the shooter had been positioned at a distance, possibly hidden in the woods surrounding the hunting property. The weapon was likely a rifle, based on the characteristics of the wound. But like Jason's case, no weapon was recovered, and no shell casings were found at the scene. Whoever killed Tommy had either collected their brass or used a weapon that didn't eject casings. Again, this suggested planning and knowledge how to avoid leaving evidence. Over the years, several people who had previously refused to talk began to come forward. In 2022, a former friend of Brooks Houck contacted investigators with information. This person claimed that Brooks had made statements shortly after Crystal disappeared that suggested he knew she was dead. According to the witness, Brooks had said something along the lines of, "She's gone and no one's gonna find her." The witness hadn't reported this at the time because they were afraid of retribution from the Houck family. But after Tommy Ballard's murder, after years of watching Crystal's family suffer, the witness decided to speak up. Investigators took the statement seriously, but without corroborating evidence. It was just one person's word against Brooks's denials. Another witness came forward with information about the night Jason Ellis was killed. This person claimed to have been driving on the Bluegrass Parkway around the time of the shooting, and had seen a vehicle parked on the side of the road near exit 34, not far from where Jason's cruiser was found. The vehicle was dark-colored, possibly a truck or SUV, and the witness remembered it because it seemed out of place at that time of night. The witness couldn't provide a license plate number or a detailed description, but the information was logged and cross-referenced with other tips. Investigators wondered, was this the shooter's vehicle? Had they parked there, walked to the ambush site, and returned to their vehicle after killing Jason? Then there was a witness who came forward about the Netherland murders. This person lived near the Netherland home, and claimed to have seen a person walking on the road late at night around the time of the murders. The person was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be in a hurry. The witness didn't think much of it at the time, and didn't report it until years later when they realized the timing might be significant. Again, it was a vague tip, but investigators followed up, mapping out possible routes the person might have taken and looking for any connections to known suspects. Every piece of information, no matter how small, was added to the growing pile of evidence. But none of it was enough to make an arrest. In 2023, 8 years after Crystal Rogers disappeared, the FBI announced they had a federal grand jury to hear evidence in her case. This was a major development. A grand jury has the power to issue subpoenas, compel testimony, and review evidence that might not be admissible in a regular trial. It's a tool prosecutors use when they're building a case and need to gather additional information from reluctant witnesses. The fact that the FBI was using a grand jury suggested that they believed they had enough evidence to potentially bring charges, but they needed testimony from people who had so far refused to cooperate. Brooks Houck was subpoenaed to testify. So were members of his family. So were several people who had been friends or associates of Crystal. The grand jury proceedings were secret, as is standard procedure. No one outside the investigation knew what was being discussed, what evidence was being presented, or who was saying what. Crystal's family waited anxiously. Was this finally it? Was this the moment they had been waiting for? Months passed. The grand jury continued to meet, hearing testimony, reviewing evidence, deliberating on whether charges should be brought. And then, in late 2023, the grand jury concluded its proceedings. No indictments were issued. The news was devastating. After all the searches, all the evidence, all the testimony, the FBI and federal prosecutors had decided there wasn't enough to charge Brooks Houck or anyone else with Crystal's disappearance. The case remained open, but the momentum that had been building seemed to deflate. Crystal's family was heartbroken. Sherry Ballard released a statement saying that she was disappointed but not defeated. She vowed to continue fighting, to continue searching, to continue demanding justice for her daughter and her husband. But the reality was sobering. If the FBI, with all its resources and expertise, couldn't build a case strong enough to indict Brooks Houck, what hope was there that justice would ever be served? Just when it seemed like all the Bardstown cases were destined to remain unsolved, something unexpected happened. In early 2024, investigators announced that they had identified a person of interest in the murder of Officer Jason Ellis. They didn't release a name. They didn't provide details about what led them to this person. But they confirmed that new evidence had come to light, evidence that pointed to a specific individual. The announcement sent shockwaves through Bardstown. After 11 years, was Jason's case finally going to be solved? Rumors immediately began to circulate. Some people believed the person of interest was Nick Houck, that investigators had finally found evidence linking him to Jason's murder. Others speculated that was someone completely unexpected, someone who had never been on the radar before. The Kentucky State Police asked for the public's help, urging anyone with information to come forward. They released a statement saying that even the smallest detail could be crucial, that someone out there knew something, and that it was time to break the silence. Days turned into weeks. Investigators continued to work the case, following up on leads, interviewing witnesses, building their evidence. But no arrest was made. The person of interest remained unnamed and uncharged. And once again the community was left waiting, wondering, hoping that this time would be different. By 2024, the Bardstown murders had been unsolved for over a decade. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Parents were afraid to let their children play outside. People installed security systems, bought guns, and developed elaborate safety routines. Trust had broken down completely. Neighbors who had once been friends now avoided each other, unsure of who might be involved in the crimes. The constant media attention didn't help. True crime podcasts dissected every detail of the cases. YouTube channels produced hour-long videos analyzing evidence and proposing theories. Reddit threads debated whether Brooks Houck was guilty, whether the cases were connected, whether there was a cover-up. Some of this attention was helpful, keeping the cases in the public eye and generating new tips. But some of it was harmful, spreading misinformation, harassing potential suspects, and turning real people's tragedies into entertainment. The victims' families struggled with this exploitation. Sherry Ballard appreciated the support from true crime enthusiasts, but she was also frustrated by the wild theories and baseless accusations that circulated online. She wanted justice, not conspiracy theories. She wanted her daughter's body found, not another podcast episode that rehashed the same information without providing new answers. The families of Jason Ellis, Kathy and Samantha Netherland, and Tommy Ballard all felt the same way. They wanted closure. They wanted justice. They wanted peace. But all they had were questions. While Brooks Houck remained the primary focus in Crystal's case, investigators had looked at other possible suspects over the years. There was a man Crystal had briefly dated before Brooks. Investigators interviewed him multiple times, but he had a solid alibi for the night she disappeared, and no apparent motive to harm her. There was a former coworker who had allegedly been jealous of Crystal's relationship with Brooks. Again, this lead was investigated and dismissed. There were rumors of other men in Crystal's life, secret relationships, hidden connections. But every rumor was checked, and none led to credible evidence. In Jason Ellis's case, investigators had looked at people he had arrested. People who might have held grudges, people who had threatened him in the past. They interviewed dozens of individuals, some with violent criminal histories, some with known hatred of police. None of them panned out. In the Netherland case, investigators had explored the possibility that the murders were committed by a student or parent connected to Bardstown Elementary, someone who had a grievance against Kathy. They found no evidence to support this theory. They also looked into whether Samantha had been the primary target, whether someone at her high school had been obsessed with her or angry with her. Again, nothing. It was maddening. Every avenue seemed to lead to a dead end. One of the most puzzling aspects of the Bardstown cases was the timing. If these cases were connected, why were they spread out over several years? Jason Ellis was killed in May 2013. Kathy and Samantha Netherland were killed in April 2014. Crystal Rogers disappeared in July 2015. Tommy Ballard was killed in November 2015. If a single person or group was responsible for all these crimes, what was the pattern? What was the trigger? Some theorists believe that each murder was a response to something. Jason was killed because he discovered something. The Netherlands were killed because they knew something. Crystal was killed to silence her. And Tommy was killed to stop his investigation. But this theory required a level of coordination and planning that seemed almost impossible. Others believed that the timing was random, that the crimes were opportunistic rather than planned, and that the connections people saw were just coincidences magnified by the small size of the community. But coincidences only stretch so far. 5 people dead or missing in a town of 13,000, all within 4 years, all unsolved. That wasn't coincidence. That was something darker. Despite the lack of arrests, despite the years of frustration and heartbreak, the people of Bardstown refused to let these cases be forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of each victim's death or disappearance, vigils were held, candles were lit, names were spoken aloud. Jason Ellis, Samantha Netherland, Crystal Rogers, Tommy Ballard. Their faces appeared on billboards, posters, social media posts. Their stories were told and retold, passed down to younger generations who hadn't been alive when the crimes occurred, but who understood that these cases defined their town. Bardstown became known as the most beautiful small town in America in tourism brochures, but locals knew a darker truth. It was also one of the most haunted, not by ghosts, but by unanswered questions, by the knowledge that killers walked among them, by the fear that justice might never come. But they held on to hope, because hope was all they had left. As the years passed and the Bardstown cases remained unsolved, investigators turned to increasingly sophisticated technology in hopes of finding the breakthrough they desperately needed. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. This technique, which combines DNA analysis with genealogical research, had solved decades-old murders by identifying suspects through distant relatives who had submitted their DNA to ancestry databases. In 2024, investigators announced that they were exploring the use of genetic genealogy in the Netherlands case, where DNA evidence had been collected from the crime scene, but had never matched anyone in the traditional criminal databases. The process was complex and time-consuming. Forensic genealogists had to build family trees based on DNA matches, then work backward to identify potential suspects. It required patience, expertise, and often a bit of luck. Crystal's family hoped that similar technology could be applied to her case, but without a body, there was limited DNA evidence to work with. The samples collected from Brooks Houck's property had been inconclusive, and despite the cadaver dog alerts, investigators hadn't found biological evidence that could definitively prove Crystal had been killed there. In Jason Ellis's case, investigators were using new ballistics technology to analyze the evidence from the shooting. Advanced imaging and comparison technique allowed them to examine the wound characteristics, the trajectory of the bullets, and the likely type of ammunition used with greater precision than had been possible in 2013. They were also using geographical profiling, a technique that analyzes the locations of crimes to predict where the offender might live or work. By mapping out the locations of all the Bardstown cases, investigators hoped to identify patterns that might point to a specific area or neighborhood. But technology could only do so much. At the end of the day, solving these cases required human intelligence. Someone talking, someone confessing, someone providing the piece of information that would finally make everything cling to place. Investigators believed that multiple people in Bardstown knew exactly what happened to Crystal Rogers, who killed Jason Ellis, who murdered Kathy and Samantha Netherland, and who shot Tommy Ballard. These weren't strangers who had passed through town and disappeared. These were locals, people who lived in the community, people who had families and jobs and daily routines. And in a town as small as Bardstown, it was almost impossible to commit multiple murders without someone knowing something. The problem was getting people to talk. Fear was a powerful motivator for silence. If you believed that speaking up could get you killed, and Tommy Ballard's murder seemed to prove that it could, then staying quiet was the rational choice. Loyalty was another factor. In small towns, family connections run deep. People protect their own, even when their own might be guilty of terrible crimes. And then there was complicity. If you knew about a crime and didn't report it, you could be charged as an accessory after the fact. Some people who had information may have stayed silent, not just to protect the perpetrators, but to protect themselves from prosecution. Over the years, investigators had granted immunity to several individuals in exchange for testimony. These deals allowed witnesses to come forward with information without fear of being charged for their role in covering up the crimes. But even with immunity, some people refused to talk. One particularly frustrating case involved a person who had allegedly been told by Brooks Houck what happened to Crystal Rogers. This individual had been offered complete immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying to the grand jury about what Brooks had said. The person refused, even with legal protection. Even with the opportunity to help solve the case, this individual chose silence. Investigators suspected that the refusal was driven by fear. Fear of retaliation from the Houck family or fear of being ostracized by the community. But whatever the reason, it was another dead in a case filled with them. In 2023, a disturbing revelation came to light that cast doubt on the integrity of the investigations. A former evidence technician with the Nelson County Sheriff's Office came forward with allegations that evidence from the Bardstown cases had gone missing from the evidence room. The technician didn't specify which case or what evidence had disappeared, but the implication was clear: someone with access to the evidence room had removed items, possibly to protect themselves or someone they knew. The sheriff's office launched an internal investigation, reviewing the chain of custody for all evidence related to the Bardstown cases. They found discrepancies. Items that should have been logged and stored were unaccounted for. Documentation was incomplete. Some evidence bags had been opened and resealed without proper authorization. The discovery was devastating. If evidence had been tampered with or destroyed, it could compromise the entire investigation. Defense attorneys could argue that any case built on the remaining evidence was tainted, that the chain of custody had been broken, and that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the evidence was authentic. The allegation also raised the question of who had access to the evidence room and why they would want to remove evidence. Was it a corrupt officer protecting a colleague? Was it a family member of a suspect who worked in law enforcement? Was it someone trying to cover up their own involvement? The sheriff's office insisted that they were taking the allegations seriously and that they would cooperate fully with any external investigation. But the damage was done. Public trust in the investigation had already been fragile. Now it was shattered. How could the community believe that justice would be served if the people responsible for preserving evidence couldn't be trusted? As investigators continued to dig into the cases, a theory began to coalesce that was both comprehensive and terrifying. What if the Bardstown murders weren't isolated incidents, but rather the work of a criminal network that included law enforcement officers, local businessmen, and other influential community members? This theory suggested that Bardstown had become a hub for illegal activity, drug trafficking, money laundering, corruption, and that the murders were committed to protect that network. According to this theory, Jason Ellis had discovered evidence of police corruption and was killed before he could report it. Kathy and Samantha Netherland had witnessed something connected to the criminal network, perhaps a drug transaction or meeting, and were killed to silence them. Crystal Rogers had learned about the network through Brooks Houck, who was allegedly involved in illegal activities, and was killed when she threatened to go to the authorities. Tommy Ballard was killed because his investigation into Crystal's disappearance was getting too close to exposing the network. This theory explained several puzzling aspects of the cases: why the investigations had stalled despite significant evidence, why witnesses were afraid to come forward, why evidence had allegedly gone missing, why no arrests had been made even when suspects seemed obvious. If members of law enforcement were part of the network, they could sabotage investigations from the inside. They could warn suspects when searches were planned. They could lose evidence, intimidate witnesses, and ensure that cases never went to trial. It was a conspiracy theory. But unlike many conspiracy theories, it had some basis in fact. Nick Houck had been a police officer who was fired for interfering with the investigation into his brother's girlfriend's disappearance. Other officers in the Bardstown Police Department and Nelson County Sheriff's Office had been investigated for misconduct over the years, though none had been directly connected to the murders. There were documented cases of small-town corruption in Kentucky and across the country, where law enforcement officers had protected criminal enterprises in exchange for money or other benefits. So while the network theory was speculative, it wasn't impossible. One avenue of investigation that received less public attention, but was crucial to understanding the cases, was the financial analysis. Investigators obtained search warrants for the financial records of Brooks Houck and his family members, looking for evidence of illegal income, large unexplained transactions, or payments that might indicate criminal activity. They found some interesting patterns. Brooks Houck's business had received several large cash deposits in the months following Crestel's disappearance. When asked about these deposits, Brooks claimed they were from legitimate business transactions, but he couldn't provide documentation to support that claim. Investigators also discovered that Brooks had sold several properties shortly after Crestel disappeared, generating significant amounts of cash. Was this suspicious timing, or was it just coincidence? Financial investigators also looked at Nick Houck's bank records. They found that he had made several large purchases in the year following Crestel's disappearance, including a new truck and expensive recreational equipment. Where had the money come from? Nick's salary as a police officer wouldn't have been enough to cover these expenses. Nick claimed that he had saved the money over time, and that the purchases were unrelated to Crestel's case. But investigators remained skeptical. They also examined the financial records of other people connected to the cases, looking for patterns of cash transactions, unexplained income, or connections to known criminal enterprises. What they found was a web of financial relationships that suggested some level of organized criminal activity in Bardstown, though they couldn't definitively link it to the murders. There were cash businesses that might have been fronts for money laundering. There were individuals with connections to drug trafficking operations in Louisville and Lexington. There were real estate transactions that seemed designed to hide the true ownership of properties. It was circumstantial, but it painted a picture of a community where not everything was as it seemed, where some people were making money through illegal means, and where those people might be willing to kill to protect their interests. In 2024, Nelson County elected a new sheriff who campaigned on a promise to bring fresh energy to the investigation of the Bardstown cases. Sheriff Ramon Piñeiro had a background in federal law enforcement and had worked on high-profile cases involving organized crime and public corruption. He was an outsider, someone with no personal connections to the families involved in the Bardstown cases, someone who could approach the investigations without the baggage of local politics and relationships. Upon taking office, Sheriff Piñeiro announced that he would be conducting a comprehensive review of all the evidence in the Bardstown cases. He brought in outside experts to examine the work that had been done, to identify gaps in the investigations, and to recommend new approaches. He also made a public commitment to transparency, promising regular updates to the community and the victims' families about the progress of the investigations. This was a significant change from the past, where information had been tightly controlled, and the families often felt like they were being kept in the dark. Sheriff Piñeiro also announced that he would be working closely with the FBI, the Kentucky State Police, and other agencies to ensure that every available resource was being used to solve these cases. The families were cautiously optimistic. They had heard promises before. They had seen new sheriffs and new investigators come and go over the years, each one vowing to solve the cases, each one ultimately failing to deliver. But Sheriff Pineroa seemed different. He seemed genuinely committed to justice, and he had the experience and resources to make a difference. Time would tell if this new approach would finally yield results. Over the years, investigators had received hundreds of anonymous tips about the Bardstown cases. Some came through the official tip line, others came through Crime Stoppers. Some were submitted online through social media or true crime forums. Most of the tips were useless, vague accusations, wild theories, or information that had already been investigated and dismissed. But some of the anonymous tips contained details that were specific, credible, and potentially valuable. One anonymous caller claimed to have overheard a conversation at a local bar where someone bragged about taking care of Jason Ellis. The caller provided a description of the person who made the statement, but when investigators tried to track down the caller to get more information, they couldn't be reached. Another tip came through an encrypted messaging app, claiming that Crystal Rogers' body was buried on a property that hadn't been searched yet. The tipster provided GPS coordinates and specific details about landmarks near the burial site. Investigators organized a search of the location, bringing in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing. Was the tip a hoax? Or had the body been moved before the search could be conducted? There was no way to know. Yet another anonymous tip suggested that multiple people in Bardstown knew what happened to Crystal and had been paid to keep quiet. The tip didn't provide names or specific details, but it reinforced the theory that there was a conspiracy of silence protecting the killers. Investigators followed up on every credible tip, but the anonymity made it difficult to verify the information or to bring the tipsters in for additional questioning. Some anonymous tipsters were genuinely afraid of retaliation and couldn't come forward publicly. Others were simply stirring up trouble, wasting investigators' time and resources. Sorting through the noise to find the signal was one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. In late 2024, investigators received information that someone in a Kentucky prison had been telling other inmates that they knew who killed Kathy and Samantha Netherland. This wasn't the first jailhouse confession related to the case, but this one seemed different. The inmate who was allegedly sharing information had connections to Bardstown and had been in the area at the time of the Netherland murders. More importantly, this inmate had specific knowledge about the crime scene that hadn't been made public. Investigators brought the inmate in for questioning. At first, the inmate denied saying anything about the Netherland case. But as the interrogation continued and investigators presented evidence that contradicted the denials, the inmate's story began to change. The inmate claimed that they had been told about the murders by someone else, someone who had confessed to committing the crimes while high on drugs. According to the inmate, this person had described breaking into the Netherland home, searching for valuables, and panicking when confronted by Kathy and Samantha. The person had shot them both to avoid being identified. The inmate provided a name. Investigators immediately began tracking down this individual. They discovered that the person had a lengthy criminal record, including burglary, assault, and drug-related offenses. They also discovered that this person had been living near Bardstown in 2014 and had been initial investigation into the Netherland murders. At the time, the person had denied any involvement and had provided an alibi that investigators hadn't been able to fully verify or completely disprove. Now, with new information suggesting that this person might have confessed to someone in prison, investigators had grounds to take another look. They obtained a search warrant for the person's current residence and brought them in for questioning. The individual invoked to an attorney and refused to answer any questions. Investigators searched the residence but didn't find any physical evidence connecting the person to the Netherland murders. Without a confession, without physical evidence, and without witnesses willing to testify, prosecutors didn't have enough to file charges. The person was released, and once again, a promising lead evaporated into nothing. The DNA evidence in the Netherland case had always been both a source of hope and frustration. Multiple DNA profiles had been extracted from the crime scene, which wasn't unusual. In any home, you'd expect to find DNA from the residents, their friends and family members, and anyone who had visited recently. But there were also DNA profiles that couldn't be explained. Unknown contributors who shouldn't have been in the home. One of these profiles became the focus of intense investigation. The DNA belonged to a male individual who wasn't in any criminal database. That meant either the person had never been arrested, or they had committed the crime before DNA collection became standard practice. Investigators tried to identify the DNA through genetic genealogy, building family trees and trying to narrow down potential suspects. The process was painstakingly slow. They identified several possible relatives of the unknown DNA contributor, but when they contacted these individuals and asked them to provide voluntary DNA samples, most refused. Without a court order compelling them to provide DNA, and without probable cause to obtain such an order, investigators were stuck. They also had to consider the possibility that the DNA was innocent, a repairman who had been in the home, a delivery person, a friend of Samantha's who had visited before the murders. DNA evidence is powerful, but it's not magic. It can place someone at a scene, but it can't always tell you when they were there or what they were doing. And in the Netherlands case, the DNA evidence raised more questions than it answered. Criminal profilers had been consulted on the Bardstown cases multiple times over the years, trying to create psychological profiles of the perpetrators that might help investigators narrow their search. For Jason Ellis's murder, profilers described the killer as someone who was organized, patient, and familiar with law enforcement procedures. The ambush required planning, knowledge of Jason's route and habits, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. This profile suggested someone with military or law enforcement training, or someone who had studied police tactics extensively. It also suggested a personal motive. Ambushing a police officer is high risk. The killer had to have a strong reason to take that risk. Either revenge, fear of being exposed, or eliminating a threat. For the Netherlands murders, profilers had a more difficult task. The violence of the crime suggested rage or desperation, but the lack of forensic evidence suggested some level of control and planning. This contradiction made it hard to create a consistent profile. Was the killer organized or disorganized? Were the murders premeditated or spontaneous? Some profilers believed there might have been two perpetrators, one who was calm and controlled, and another who was emotional and violent. This would explain the contradictions in the crime scene evidence. For Crystal Rogers' disappearance, profilers believed the perpetrator was someone close to her, someone who knew her routine, her vulnerabilities, and her relationships. The disposal of her body, assuming she was dead, would have required time, resources, and local knowledge. It suggested someone who knew the area well, who knew where to hide a body where it wouldn't be found. The profile pointed to Brooks Houck, but profiles aren't evidence. They're tools to guide investigations, not proof of guilt. For Tommy Ballard's murder, profilers described the killer as someone who was willing to kill to protect secrets. Someone who saw Tommy as a genuine threat that had to be eliminated. The shooting was professional, one shot from a distance, with no witnesses and no evidence left behind. This suggested someone with shooting skills and knowledge of the property where Tommy was hunting. All of these profiles were consistent with the theory that the cases were connected, that the perpetrators were local, and that they had skills and knowledge that helped them evade justice. But knowing what kind of person committed these crimes was very different from knowing who actually did it. As the years passed, a disturbing realization began to set in. The next generation of Bardstown residents was growing up in the shadow of these unsolved murders. Children who had been in elementary school when Jason Ellis was killed were now adults. Teenagers who had known Samantha Netherland were now parents themselves. And Crystal Rogers' children, who had been young when their mother disappeared, were now teenagers and young adults, living with the pain of not knowing what happened to her. The trauma had been passed down. Young people in Bardstown grew up hearing stories about the murders, learning to be afraid, learning not to trust certain people or certain families. Some left town as soon as they could, unwilling to raise their own children in a place that felt cursed. Others stayed, determined to find answers, to honor the victims, to ensure that their deaths and disappearance would never be forgotten. And some, disturbingly, seemed to know more than they should. Investigators had received tips suggesting that the children of some suspects had been told things by their parents, hints, confessions, or outright admissions of guilt. But these children were trapped. Turning in your own parent, even if you knew they had committed murder, was an almost impossible choice. Fear, loyalty, and the complexity of family bonds kept them silent. Investigators hoped that as these children grew older, as they had families of their own, and began to understand the magnitude of what had happened, some of them might find the courage to come forward. But so far, that hope had not been realized. In 2025, the 10th anniversary of Crystal Rogers' disappearance was marked with attended by hundreds of people. Sherry Ballard stood before the crowd, her face etched with years of pain, but also with a fierce determination that had never wavered. She spoke about Crystal, about the woman her daughter had been, about the mother, the sister, the friend who was taken too soon. She spoke about Tommy, about her husband's relentless search for justice and the ultimate price he paid for refusing to give up. And she made a promise: I will never stop looking for Crystal. I will never stop fighting for justice. And I will never let the people responsible for this forget what they've done. The crowd applauded. Some were crying. Others stood in silent solidarity. 10 years had passed, and Crystal was still missing. Jason Ellis's murder was still unsolved. The Netherlands case was still cold. Tommy Ballard's killer had never been caught. But the people of Bardstown refused to forget. They carried the weight of these unsolved crimes with them every day, a collective burden that shaped their community and their lives. And they held on to the belief that someday, somehow, the truth would come out, that justice would prevail, that the darkness that had consumed their town would finally be brought into the light. As we move deeper into 2025, more than a decade has passed since the first murder that shattered Bardstown's peace. Officer Jason Ellis was killed in May 2013, 12 years ago. Kathy and Samantha Netherland were murdered in April 2014, 11 years ago. Crystal Rogers disappeared in July 2015, 10 years ago. Tommy Ballard was killed in November 2016, 9 years ago. And despite the passage of time, despite the involvement of multiple law enforcement agencies, despite the advances in forensic technology, despite the millions of dollars spent on investigations, not a single person has been arrested or charged in connection with any of these cases. The investigations remain officially open and active. The FBI continues to describe Crystal Rogers' case as a priority, with agents regularly reviewing evidence and following up on new leads. In their most recent public statement, they emphasized that they believe Crystal was murdered and that they are committed to finding her remains and bringing her killer to justice. The Kentucky State Police maintain that Jason Ellis's murder investigation is ongoing, with detectives assigned to the case full-time. They continue to encourage anyone with information to come forward, offering a substantial reward for tips that lead to an arrest and conviction. The Nelson County Sheriff's Office, under Sheriff Pinero's leadership, has reorganized its approach to the Netherlands murders, bringing in cold case specialists and utilizing new forensic techniques to examine evidence collected from the crime scene. And while Tommy Ballard's murder is investigated separately, the sheriff's office has acknowledged the possibility that it may be connected to the other cases and is coordinating with investigators working on the other investigations. But acknowledgement and action are two different things. The families of the victims see the press releases, hear the meetings with investigators, and year after year, they receive the same message: we're working on it. We haven't given up. We need more time. How much more time? How many more years will pass before someone is held accountable? These are the questions that haunt Bardstown, questions that have no answers, only the slow, grinding passage of days and months and years. Brooks Huck still lives in Bardstown. He has never been charged with Crystal Rogers' disappearance. He has never been arrested. In the eyes of the law, he is an innocent man. But in Bardstown, his name is synonymous with Crystal's case. People point to him on the street. They whisper when he walks into local businesses. Some refuse to serve him. Others confront him directly, demanding to know what he did with Crystal. Brooks rarely responds. He maintains his silence, going about his life as if the past 10 years never happened. He continues to run his business. Though it has suffered significantly from the negative publicity, he keeps a low profile, avoiding the media, declining interviews, and staying away from public events. His family remains protective of him, insisting that he is innocent and that the focus on Brooks has prevented investigators from finding the real killer. Nick Hack, the former Bardstown police officer who was fired for interfering with the investigation, has also remained in the area. He has never been charged with any crime related to Crystal's disappearance or any of the other Bardstown cases. He works in construction now, having left law enforcement permanently after his termination. Like his brother, Nick maintains his innocence and refuses to speak publicly about the cases. Other people who have been questioned over the years, other potential suspects and persons of interest, continue to live their lives. Some have moved away from Bardstown, seeking fresh starts in communities where their names aren't associated with unsolved murders. Others remain, trapped in town that will never forget, never forgive, and never stop suspecting them of terrible crimes. After more than a decade of investigation, there are still fundamental questions about the Bardstown cases that remain unanswered. In Jason Ellis's case, who placed the debris on the road, and how did they know Jason would stop to clear it? Where did the shooter position themselves, and how did they escape without being seen? What was the motive? Was it personal revenge, a professional hit, or something else entirely? Why has no one come forward with information about who was responsible? In the Netherlands case, how did the killer gain entry to the home? Was the door unlocked, or did Kathy or Samantha let them in? Was the killer someone they knew or a stranger? What was the motive? Was it robbery, personal vendetta, or random violence? Whose DNA was found at the scene, and why haven't they been identified? Why were both victims killed? If the motive was robbery, why not leave after killing Kathy? In Crystal Rogers' case, what happened on the night of July 3, 2015? Did Crystal leave Brooks's house voluntarily, or was she forced? How did her car end up on the Bluegrass Parkway with a flat tire? If she was killed, where is her body? Why haven't the extensive searches found any trace of her remains? Who helped dispose of her body? Why won't anyone with information come forward? In Tommy Ballard's case, who knew Tommy would be hunting on his property that day? Where was the shooter positioned? And how did they leave without being detected? Was Tommy killed because of his investigation into Crystal's case, or was there another motive? Why has no one been arrested despite the suspicious circumstances? These questions have been asked thousands of times by investigators, by journalists, by true crime enthusiasts, and most painfully, by the families who lost their loved ones. And still there are no definitive answers. In recent years, a specific theory about the Bardstown cases has gained significant traction among investigators and observers. The theory is this: the cases are connected, but not through a single perpetrator or even a single conspiracy. Instead, they are connected through a web of relationships, mutual protection, and overlapping criminal activity. According to this theory, Jason Ellis was killed by someone involved in criminal activity that he had discovered or was about to discover. This person may have had connections to law enforcement and knew how to plan and execute an ambush without leaving evidence. Kathy and Samantha Netherland were killed by someone different, possibly during a home invasion or robbery gone wrong. But this perpetrator may have had connections to the same criminal network, and information about the murder may have been shared among people in that network. Crystal Rogers was killed by Brooks Houck, possibly with help from family members. The motive was personal, a relationship gone wrong, a custody dispute, or something else that escalated to violence. Tommy Ballard was killed by someone who wanted to stop his investigation into Crystal's case. This person may or may not be Brooks Houck, but they were motivated by the fear that Tommy was getting too close to the truth. What connects these cases is not a master plan or a serial killer, but rather a community where certain people know certain things, where silence is maintained through fear and loyalty, and where the normal mechanisms of justice have been compromised by corruption, intimidation, and the close-knit nature of small-town relationships. This theory is both more complex and more plausible than the idea of a single killer or a vast conspiracy. It explains why the cases seem connected, but of different characteristics. It explains why witnesses won't come forward, They're afraid not of one person, but of a network of people who protect each other. It explains why investigations have stalled. Corruption doesn't have to be widespread to be effective. Just a few people in key positions can sabotage justice. And most disturbingly, it suggests that there may never be a single, satisfying resolution to the Bardstown cases. There may be multiple perpetrators, multiple motives, and multiple truths that only partially overlap. In 2024 and 2025, a small number of witnesses who had previously remained silent finally came forward with information. One witness, a former friend of Brooks' house, provided a statement to the FBI describing conversations where Brooks had allegedly made incriminating statements about Crystal. According to this witness, Brooks had said things that suggested he knew Crystal was dead and that he had been involved in her death. The witness claimed that Brooks had once said, "She wanted to take my kid away from me. I couldn't let that happen." The witness also described Brooks as being unusually calm in the days after Crystal disappeared, showing no signs of worry or concern that would be expected from someone whose girlfriend had gone missing. This testimony was significant, but without physical evidence to corroborate it, prosecutors were hesitant to bring charges based solely on hearsay statements reported years after the fact. Another witness came forward with information about the night Tommy Ballard was killed. This person claimed to have seen a vehicle leaving the area around the time of the shooting, a vehicle that didn't belong to anyone they recognized. The witness had been afraid to come forward earlier because they worried about retaliation, but after seeing that a decade had passed with no resolution, they decided to speak up. Investigators followed up on this lead, trying to identify the vehicle and determine who might have been driving it. The information was valuable, but without being able to identify the specific vehicle or driver, it was another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Perhaps most significantly, a witness came forward with information about the Netherland murders that contradicted some of the early assumptions about the case. This witness claimed to have seen Kathy Netherland arguing with someone in the parking lot of Bardstown Elementary School in the days before she was killed. The witness didn't recognize the person Kathy was arguing with and couldn't provide a detailed description, but they remembered the encounter because it was unusual. Kathy was normally calm and composed, but in this instance she appeared upset and angry. Was this argument connected to her murder? Did Kathy have a conflict with someone that escalated to violence? Investigators interviewed current and former staff at the school, trying to identify who Kathy might have been arguing with and what the dispute was about. They found no definitive answers, but the information opened up new avenues of investigation that had not been previously explored. In an effort to encourage more people to come forward with information, the combined reward for information leading to arrests and convictions in the Bardstown cases was increased to $250,000. The money came from multiple sources: the FBI, the Kentucky State Police, private donors, and the families of the victims who had pooled their resources. It was a substantial amount of money, enough to change someone's life, enough to make someone reconsider their loyalty to a killer, enough to potentially overcome the fear that had kept witnesses silent for so long. Billboards went up across Kentucky advertising the reward. Social media campaigns promoted the information. News outlets ran stories reminding the public that the cases were still unsolved and that anyone with information could make a difference. The announcement generated hundreds of new tips. Most were worthless, people hoping to claim the reward with vague or false information. But a few were credible, and investigators followed up on each one, hoping that this time finally they would get the breakthrough they needed. Sherry Ballard has lived in a state of perpetua for a decade. She lost her daughter. She lost her husband. She lost the life she thought she would have, the future she had planned, the simple joys of watching her grandchildren grow up with their mother present. Instead, she has spent 10 years searching, advocating, demanding justice. She has appeared on countless television shows, podcasts, and news programs. She has organized vigil search parties and fundraisers. She has lobbied lawmakers to improve resources for missing person cases. She has done everything a mother could possibly do. And yet, Crystal is still missing. Tommy's killer is still free. The toll on Sherry's health has been significant. The stress, the grief, the constant vigilance, it has aged her beyond her years. Friends worry about her, urging her rest, to take care of herself. But Sherry can't rest. Not while her daughter is out there somewhere waiting to be found. Not while the people responsible are still walking free. Jason Ellis's family has lived with their own form of torture. Jason's widow has had to raise their 2 sons without their father. She has had to explain to them why their dad was killed, why the person who did it has never been caught, why justice has been denied. Jason's sons are young men now, both considering careers in law enforcement, both determined to honor their father's legacy. But they carry the weight of his unsolved murder with them every day, wondering if they will ever know who killed their father and why. The Netherland family has struggled with the brutality of Kathy and Samantha's deaths. Samantha's friends, now adults, still speak about her with tears in their eyes. She should be in her late 20s now, with a career, maybe a family of her own. Instead, her life ended at 16, cut short by senseless violence. Kathy's students, the children she taught and nurtured, remember her kindness and patience. Many of them have become teachers themselves, inspired by her example, determined to make a difference in the lives of children the way she did. But the unanswered questions about why she and Samantha were killed, about who would do such a thing, continue to haunt everyone who knew them. Despite the increased rewards, despite the new witnesses coming forward, despite the continued pressure from investigators and the media, the wall of silence in Bardstown has not completely crumbled. People still know things they won't say. Families still protect their own. Fear still keeps mouths shut. And the killers, whoever they are, continue to benefit from that silence. Investigators believe that there are at least a dozen people in Bardstown who've direct knowledge of what happened to Crystal Rogers. People who know where her body is. People who helped dispose of evidence. People who provided alibis or lied to investigators. But getting those people has proven nearly impossible. Some have been offered immunity. Some have been threatened with prosecution for obstruction of justice. Some have been appealed to on moral grounds, reminded that Crystal's children deserve to know what happened to their mother. Nothing has worked. The conspiracy of silence holds, and as long as it does, justice remains out of reach. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Bardstown cases is what investigators call the technology paradox. We live in an era where technology should make it nearly impossible to commit a perfect crime. Cell phone records, GPS data, surveillance cameras, social media activity, digital communications, all of these create a trail that investigators can follow. And yet, despite all this technology, the Bardstown cases remain unsolved. In Crystal's case, investigators have cell phone records showing that her phone was turned off shortly after she disappeared. They have GPS data showing the locations of various vehicles on the night she vanished. They have surveillance footage from cameras along routes that the perpetrator might have taken. But none of it has been conclusive enough to prove what happened or who was responsible. In Jason's case, investigators have radio communications, dispatch records, and GPS data from police vehicles. They have analyzed the traffic patterns on the Bluegrass Parkway that night, looking for vehicles that might have belonged to the shooter. But the killer left no digital trail. In the Netherland case, investigators have examined cell phone records, checked for any digital communications that might suggest a motive, and looked for any online activity that might connect a suspect to the victims. Again, nothing conclusive. The paradox is this: technology should make these crimes solvable, but it only works if the perpetrators are careless enough to leave a digital trail. And the people responsible for the Bardstown murders were not careless. They were careful, methodical, and either very lucky or very skilled at avoiding detection. In late 2024, rumors circulated through Bardstown that someone connected to the cases was dying, and had indicated they might be willing to confess before they passed. The rumors were vague. No names were mentioned publicly. No specific case was identified, but the whispers were enough to give the families hope that finally someone would tell the truth. Investigators followed up on the rumors, trying to identify who might be dying and what they might know. They tracked down several individuals who were seriously ill, people who had been questioned in the past, people who might have information. But when approached, Each one denied having anything to confess. Some claimed they didn't know anything. Others refused to speak without lawyers present. One person became angry, insisting that they were innocent and that the rumors were cruel attempts to tarnish their reputation before they died. The hoped-for deathbed confession never materialized. It may have been nothing more than wishful thinking, a rumor born from the desperate hope that someone somewhere would finally do the right thing and tell the truth before it was too late. Or it may have been real, someone with knowledge of the crimes who considered confessing, but ultimately couldn't bring themselves to do it, choosing to take their secrets to the grave rather than face the consequences of what they knew. Either way, another opportunity for justice slipped away. In 2023, a major streaming service released a documentary series about the Bardstown murders. The series was extensive, featuring interviews with investigators, family members, legal experts, and community members. It presented a comprehensive overview of all 5 cases, explored the theories connecting them, and put pressure on law enforcement to solve the crimes. The documentary brought national and international attention to Bardstown. Millions of people watched it, flooding social media with theories, speculation, and demands for justice. The "Theft Justice for Bardstown" hashtag trended on Twitter. Reddit forums dedicated to the cases exploded with activity. The increased attention generated new tips, some of which were valuable, but it also brought problems. Amateur sleuths began harassing people they suspected of being involved. Accused individuals received death threats. Some people in Bardstown felt like they were living in a fishbowl, with the entire world watching and judging. The families had mixed feelings about the documentary. On one hand, they appreciated the attention and the pressure it put on investigators to solve the cases. On the other hand, they were exhausted by having their trauma turned into entertainment, by watching actors reenact their loved ones' final moments, by reading comments from strangers who thought they knew what happened based on a few hours of edited footage. Still, if the documentary helped solve even one of the cases, the families agreed it would be worth the discomfort. But as of now, despite the massive attention, the cases remain unsolved. The investigations continue. Detectives still work the cases, reviewing evidence, following up on tips, waiting for the piece of information that will finally break everything open. The family still search, still advocate, still hope. The community still remembers, still grieves, still suspects. And the killers, whoever they are, still walk free. What happens next depends on factors that are difficult to predict. Will someone finally come forward with information that leads to an arrest? Will advances in forensic technology provide new evidence that was previously undetectable? Will one of the suspects make a mistake, say something incriminating, or leave a trail that investigators can follow? Will someone on their deathbed finally decide to confess? Or will these cases remain unsolved indefinitely, becoming a permanent part of Bardstown's identity, a dark legacy that future generations will inherit along with the town's Bourbon heritage and small-town charm? No one knows. All anyone can do is wait, hope, and refuse to forget. Bardstown will never be the same. The murders have fundamentally altered the character of the community. The trust that once existed between neighbors has been broken. The sense of safety that defined small-town life has been shattered. Parents are more protective of their children. People lock their doors at night. Strangers are viewed with suspicion. And certain names, Ellis, Netherland, Rogers, Ballard, carry weight that they never should have had to carry. But Bardstown has also shown resilience. The community has come together to support the victims' families. They have organized fundraisers, search parties, and memorial events. They have kept the cases in the public eye, refusing to let them be forgotten. And they have demanded better from their law enforcement, from their elected officials, and from each other. Bardstown has learned that evil can exist anywhere, even in the most beautiful small towns in America. But it has also learned that good people, determined people, can fight back against that evil, even when justice seems impossibly far away. 5 people. 5 lives cut short or stolen away. 5 families left to pick up the pieces of their shattered worlds. Jason Ellis never got to see his sons grow up, never got to retire from the job he loved, never got to grow old with the woman he married. Kathy Netherland never got to see another class of students graduate, never got to watch her daughter become the nurse she dreamed of being, never got to experience the simple joys she had earned through decades of service to others. Samantha Netherland never got to go to prom, never got to graduate high school, never got to fall in love, never got to become the woman she was meant to be. Crystal Rogers never got to see her children grow up, never got to escape the relationship that may have cost her life, never got the chance to be found, to be laid to rest, to be mourned properly. Tommy Ballard never got to find his daughter, never got to see justice served, never got to experience peace after years of searching and fighting. These are the real costs of the Bardstown murders. Not just the unsolved cases, not just the failed investigations, but the human lives that were taken, the futures that were stolen, the families that were destroyed. How could someone do this? How could multiple people do this? How could a community harbor killers for more than a decade? The world still struggles to understand this level of cruelty, this depth of evil that can hide in plain sight, disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives. The Bardstown cases remind us that monsters are not always strangers lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they are neighbors, coworkers, family members, people we think we know, people we never suspect. And sometimes, the scariest thing is not the violence itself, but the silence that protects it, the conspiracy of fear and loyalty that allows killers to remain free while their victims are mourned and their families suffer. Bardstown will carry this burden forever. But it will also carry the memory of 5 people who deserved better, who deserved justice, who deserved to be remembered not just as victims, but as individuals who lived, loved, and mattered. Jason, Samantha, Crystal, Tommy. Say their names, remember their stories, and never stop demanding the truth. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this case, please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Good night and stay safe.